public about the regional treatment center and the remaining fund balance and where we go next. So I guess we're going to have a good discussion this afternoon, but we're going to get kicked off by Brian Uvar, our city engineer, will lead the discussion for us. Good evening, Brian. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Your Honor, and members of the council. I just want to put note on that we have an attendee, Bruce Paulson from Stantec Engineering. Bruce has been with the city for quite some time through all the work done in the recent decade with the RTC. I'll turn it over to him once we get done with what I have before me right now. I just want to give you a little brief opening for this project. As you know, we received an email from the Fergus Falls Heritage Preservation Commission on September 20th. Because of this, we scheduled this work session and everything, because essentially is what I'm requesting is what the scope for phase 3, what the council would envision, if any. I have in here a paragraph excerpt from the phase 2 state grant. It's highlighted in here. I just want to go over the highlighted portion here. For these funds that we received of $3.5 million, they are reserved for the removal of debris, site preparation, and remediation, hazardous materials, abatement, and improvements for the building envelope and structural integrity to stabilize the existing buildings and structures for redevelopment in addition to demolition. As we know, the council adopted the RTC master plan and in consideration HPC's letter requesting stabilization work for the remaining portions of the campus building. I did want to point out in 2015, Stantec prepared a select buildings and town mothballing study report. Because of this, I contacted Stantec to help work with me to develop a phase 3 work scope, which is attached. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Bruce, but the attached proposal consists of various work items per building and the prioritization of the buildings, with Kirkbride Tower being top priority, followed by east and west attached. I want to just note in this proposal, it's a draft. It's subject to change, given the conversation we're going to have. Once the council directs staff and how to proceed, cost estimates will need to be developed and presented to this council to refine the phase 3 work scope, because there are insufficient funds to proceed with all the work going in the proposal. Now, just about history of the $3.5 million reserved for phase 2 and phase 3 of the RTC. To date, the project expenditures for phase 2 demolition, public improvement 9506 is approximately $2,447,000. A portion of the phase 2 was funded with the initial phase 1 grant balance in amount of about $661,000. The remaining phase 2 expenditures of $1.8 million will come from this phase 2 grant. So for purposes of this conversation, the unexpected balance for phase 2 grant is the funds remaining is about $1,714,000 of the $3.5 million. This $1.7 million has not been allocated in consideration for the phase 3. So at this time, I just want to open up to any conversations, questions you might have. As I noted, HPC's letter is included in your packet. I also had developed a little modified site plan of the campuses as it remains today. This just to help steer the conversation with all the buildings we are referring to. So at this time, I'll open up to any questions, or I'll turn it over to Bruce Paulson.
Yeah, Bill, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I'll point out 2 additional things. One thing with the legislation, if you notice in the last sentence of that, it says we cannot use any of the $3.5 million for demolition on the central tower or the U-shaped building. So in essence, we can't tear anything down under the current legislation of what remains up there. And also, in talking to Deed, when we come up with a plan, if we want to do some stabilization work, our rep from Deed told me, when you come up with that plan, let's just run that by Department of Admin to make sure they agree that it falls under this language. So that's just we'll want to just get them to tell us before we accept a contract, yes, they'll fund it too. I mean, the language is pretty clear, but I think we would still do what Deed said and just tell Department of Admin, yep, this is what we're intending to do, and make sure they say, yes, we agree. So that's...
And given to what Bill had mentioned about Deed's review for eligibility items, which I wholeheartedly agree, we would like to make sure that is mutually understood with both parties funding. However, I want to note just with also in this proposal, other than SHPO's approvals, sequential ones that they require, with D2, that could take some time as well. So, end of the day, whatever the scoping may be, based on this conversation, we would seek to maybe have a project for next spring, summer to begin with. However, that's still contingent on number one, the scoping, and then SHPO review, not to mention deeds. So, at this time, I'll just turn it over to Bruce Paulson just to go over that proposal that's before you right now.
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, Bruce.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Brian. So I don't see anything showing up on my screen, so I'll just walk through the proposal. Starting on page 1, Building 1, Administration Building. Some of
We're going to
the
try to get
exterior wood.
the microphone turned up a little bit. You're a little bit soft there, Bruce.
Let me see if I can get the volume up here.
Is there any extra copies of paper?
Can you hear me now? Hear me better now?
It's about the same yet. Now try again, Bruce.
Laurie?
Can you hear me now?
That one.
Yes.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Brian.
All right. Thank you. So Building 1, the main Kirkbride Administration Building, the first level windows were replaced at some point prior to the facility being acquired by the city, and they were replaced with aluminum windows. Second and third and fourth floors and the tower all still have wood windows. Several of the windows, the panes are broken. There's several aluminum windows in the window well on the east side of the building that are broken. Those would need to be replaced, and that's part of our exterior stabilization on Building 1. One of the other things we discussed with Brian was reinstalling the grounding finial on the tower that came down when it was struck by lightning many years ago. We were on site, did take a look, and did confirm that the grounding wire for the building does extend all the way up to the cap that's currently on the tower. And so it shouldn't be a really big issue to get that reinstalled. So one of the things that we, with the interior stabilization, we need to get some air moving in all of these buildings, but particularly in Building 1, as we go down the priority list of getting some air circulation to keep the inside of the building dry. And one of the things that we discussed within the design team, myself, my electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, were on site a couple weeks ago, was providing a small air handling unit on each floor of Building 1, and then this would kind of carry through on Building 23 as well. We're using a fabric duct that would be suspended, would be easily manipulated, and attach branches to provide air distribution, rather than trying to do one big air handling unit and then try and figure out how to do the vertical ventilation circulation. So that's part of our proposal of doing that as the base is addressing all the issues with Building 1. We'd also need to improve the electrical service under Phase 2. We brought a 200 amp service into Building 1. All the rest of the buildings have no power at this point. Building 1 has a 200 amp service that was brought in order to provide enough power to keep the dehumidification units operating in the basement of Building 1. The next, and I basically just listed the buildings in order here by number. The priorities are addressed a little bit further down in our proposal. So Building 22, we'd replace, again, we've got damaged and broken glass block windows on the main level, or on the first floor level. We'd look to replace those to reestablish the exterior control. We got some vegetation growing around the building at the foundation. We want to get rid of that, and I think Brian and I discussed that may be something that can be done by city staff. We've got a little bit of face brick, mortar joints that are falling apart, get those repaired, and some damaged brick that would be replaced just to stabilize the exterior. And then item number 5 on here kind of carries throughout the entire campus right now. The interior environment is such that you need to be wearing a face mask, preferably an N95, because there's a fair amount of mold inside all of these buildings. And so part of our proposal would be issuing a request for proposal to at least 3 companies that do mold testing, to have them come in and take a look and determine the scope of work that would be needed to remediate the mold and get it cleaned up prior to trying to do any ventilation within the building. The last thing we want to do is be blowing the mold all over the place. So we need to get rid of it first and then provide ventilation. So that's in building 22. And except for building 1 and building 23, all of the other buildings currently have existing air handling units and ductwork that supplies all the floors with the exception of the 4th floor on building 27. Building 23 does not have any interior ventilation system at all, and building 1 also doesn't have interior ventilation system. So for the rest of the buildings, depending on the scope of work, we would look at removing the existing air handling units because they've now been out of service for 15 plus years, and installing new air handling units that would connect up to the existing ductwork to provide ventilation air throughout the buildings, just to get air moving and keep it dry once everything's been cleaned up. And so the scope of work for buildings 22, 24, 26, and 28 are all very similar. All of them have good roofs. The roofs were redone 3 years ago. And so those are in good shape. Buildings 23 and building 27, east and west attached, do need roof repairs and or replacement on the shingles, as well as building 27, the north end of that building at the 4th level roof. The EPDM membrane has failed, and we've got a fair amount of water standing on the floors below on floors 2 and 1 at the north end of building 27. Building 27 also has the most exterior brick deterioration of any of the other buildings. And back in 2016, we'd taken a look at when we were doing the first mothballing project for this. We did bid out the brick restoration on building 27, and back in 2016 it was about $345,000 to repair all the brick that was damaged at that time. The brick deterioration has continued, and I would expect that cost would be higher at this point. And then the final one is building 29, the memorial building. Similar items. Building 29 also needs a new roof, windows repaired, interior space cleaned, remove the mold, and then get ventilation in. And again, would look at doing smaller units on each floor, working with SHPO to determine which window on each floor could be removed and install an intake louver to do the ventilation. So, and that would be similar to building 23, of looking at the north side, working with SHPO to make sure it's aesthetically acceptable to them to remove one of the windows in the north wall to allow those to be replaced with intake air to allow air to be basically brought into the air handling unit sitting in that north room with a fabric duct that runs right down the hallway with branches blowing into all of the rooms to provide some air movement and dry out the buildings and keep their indoor air quality such that you don't have to wear N95s to go inside the building. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
I got a question, Your Honor. As much probably for Bill and interpretation, I know it's a dangerous thing, but if we do any of these improvements, when and if somebody came along that wants to, take on board one of the buildings, what's the ramifications?
Yep, that's a good point, because I know we had talked about that over the years. We can legally, this is my interpretation, and we can clarify all this, but since we don't have a developer in hand right now, we would just be doing these improvements for stabilization. I think they would qualify under state bonding dollars. Now, if we had a developer for West Detached and we knew that right now, and then we started making improvements, we would be doing it knowing our developer would benefit from it. That would not be acceptable. But when we're just holding it unknown, then I think this language would qualify.
Yeah. And would that change the value of the building should somebody come along? Because obviously, I mean, nobody's still going to offer more than $1 for these things regardless.
Right.
I mean, the last time we looked at like the Memorial Building, the improvements alone were over $500,000. So nobody's going to pay anything for kind of an improvement that really isn't an improvement. It's a stabilization, as you say.
Right.
Right. So all of the work that we do, and in reviewing the language, yes, it indicates that you can't use the money to improve the value, but anything that we do to stabilize, and the language also says that we can use the money to stabilize the buildings. When we're doing that, we are improving the buildings. So but you're correct in that right now there are no developers, and so all of this is looked at as being stabilization or mothballing, which the language allows the city to do.
So Bruce, this is Bill again.
Yes, sir.
One other, I know in talking with Deed, one other thing we looked at as an interpretation is, we all kind of know what building envelope and stabilization is. Now, remodeling in the tower would not qualify because that's not stabilization. So we can't move walls and do things like that, but fixing roofs,
Correct.
Windows, that's my interpretation. Remodeling would not.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Bruce, did in 2015, we had numbers associated with some of these improvements or these stabilizations. We didn't have bids though. Or can you remind me what information we had in that initial report in 2015?
So in 2016, after we did the mothballing study, we did bid out a lot of the work, and most of it didn't move forward with the exception of redoing roofs on several of the buildings. But we basically bid out the exterior stabilization on all of the buildings that are still currently standing on the campus.
Okay. And so, do we have, obviously, I know we'd have to rebid it for any of this work, but do we have, based on inflation and costs, do we have any idea of what all these items, this is more than $1.7 million on this. It's a lot more than $1.7 million, right?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yep.
So do we go through the process? Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, so I think that the process at this point would be to make a decision, and on page, starting on page 3 and then going on to page 4, in conversation with Brian, we kind of set up the priority list for stabilizing and mothballing the buildings, with building 1 being the number 1, 23 and then 27 being 2 and 3, building 22, 26, 24, 28, and 29 in that order. And then, and then it's basically, looking at, how far do the existing available dollars get us? And that would be the next step in our proposal would be getting direction from the city council on how far you want us to go with the work, and then we can start assembling some opinions of probable construction cost for doing the work to see how much can we do for the available money.
Anthony, did you have another question?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. Bruce, obviously you talked about the air handling units, but on some of the buildings, there's like window AC units. Is the proposal to remove, are you deeming them as air handling units? Or are you proposing to remove them? And there's some higher ones, can we just remove those and board them up? Or do we have to replace them with a window?
My intent was that all of the existing window air conditioning units were added. They are an adverse impact on the aesthetics of the campus, and that they should be removed and glass block be reinstalled.
Right. And then can we look at like a perimeter fence or something? Obviously there's a lot of people kind of basically break in there and do damage. Is that something we should look at, is putting a 10-foot high barbed wire fence around it to stop people going in and doing more damage?
That's certainly one way to do it. I believe that the amount of vandalism that has decreased dramatically in the last couple of years. I know there's still some broken glass, and I know that the master plan report recommendations did recommend going through and boarding up all of the first floor windows. That's an added cost in itself to do that. But it's certainly an option to do that, to make it more difficult for somebody to try and throw a rock through a window. At the second floor, it's more difficult to get enough speed behind a throw to break the glass block at the second floor and above.
Your Honor,
Yeah.
if I could just add to that, what Anthony's talking about, the perimeter fence for security, I think that would be a good thing, along with maybe covering the city for some liability with a lot of the bricks that are loose up there. We just don't know when bricks are going to be falling, and there are a lot of people that walk around the building up close to it, and that is a potential risk. Along with that,
And
for adding
building
some-
27 does already have a 6-foot high fence
Right.
around the west side to keep people away from that face, which is showing the most deterioration and does have bricks falling off. There might be, on some of the other buildings, there might be some face pieces of brick that fall off, but there isn't any place else where we've got whole bricks falling off at this point.
We did remove a few just before the Summerfest this summer, but along with fencing for security, I think some yard lighting right up around the building would add some security and keep some of those people from hiding in those little niches and alcoves that they can get in.
Yeah,
Yep.
Justin, then Brent. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Maybe just to add or clarification, if I'm understanding what's highlighted in yellow for what's considered, I don't, would that fall under, could we add a fence? Because, clearly, I don't know what part that would fall under that language, but.
Right. I think we'd want to clarify that because you're reading my mind. I was having the same question, is a fence going to qualify? You could make the argument that helps stop vandalism, thus it would be stabilization. Now, will Deed see it our way? We'll see, but we could ask the question.
As far as the vandalization going down, I believe it's actually the opposite. It's going up because.
Oh, really?
Because
Okay.
I know a few of the city employees who work up in there, and I've seen the pictures inside there. When we start sealing things off so they can't move around in the biddies, they're literally bringing in sledgehammers. They're busting through the walls. The nurses' stations, they've been busting out the glass. Any place that they can't get through, they are taking sledgehammers and busting through walls. So as far as I'm concerned, the vandalization is actually going up. And that whole main floor needs to be sealed off. And then the way they've been doing it lately, is even when putting plywood on, is they're using an epoxy on there. So even if they get the screws and nails out, they literally have to sit there and pry the living heck out of them in order to get them off, which takes a lot of time. And like they said, this is a liability. Somebody goes in there and hurts themselves, they have more rights than the city has. And it's going to end up costing us an arm and a leg, and I think we need to seal this thing off.
Can I?
Yeah, please, Carol.
So, one of the things was replace the windows, and clearly vandalism seems to be a problem that we were talking about, so would it even be worth replacing windows or just seal it up?
Bottom up.
Good question.
Just another
And I
thing
think
to
if
bring.
we have an active, if we're going to seal this building off and we can't use any of the money to demo it, I think they said using a envelope, because the main tower is not going anywhere. I would just like to see the main tower sealed off. If you want to do some mold abatement and some circulation in the main tower, I'm all for patching up the roof at a minimal cost to keep the water out. And when it comes to these broken windows, put the plywood over it, paint it the same color as the building. The way that when the black stuff didn't look good, the tan stuff, it doesn't stick out as much. Seal it up. If we get a developer, we're lucky. I just feel if we start putting a lot of money into the remainder of the horseshoe, and in a couple years, we go back to the state again saying, hey, we've got no prospects on this, they're going to look at us and say, you blew about $1 million on this building and now you want to tear it down? That just doesn't show responsible. So I'm willing to appease some of the people and say, hey, let's patch up the roof, let's seal up these windows. And those other city employees said when it came to these AC units, when the state put them in, they had no intentions of them coming out. It is a major chore to pull those casements for the AC units out of those windows. I don't know if you can seal them up from the inside. I'm aesthetics, I'm not too worried about that. I don't want it to, really look bad. They've been there for how many years? If we can seal things up to keep Mother Nature out, God, hopefully we get somebody who comes in and decides they want to do something. But putting all that money, other than just basic maintenance to keep the water and everything out, I think they're going to come back at us and they're going to say, okay, you want how much more money? And part of that is tearing down what we gave you in the first place. So, I'd just focus on the main tower and do the minimum we can to the rest.
Thanks, Brent. A question, and one quick question for you, Bruce, or Brian, or when we look at the tower and then east and west attached buildings 23 and 27, do you have a professional opinion of what ballpark those repairs on those buildings might come in at? Is that gonna be more than 1.7 right there before we even get past buildings 23 and 27?
Yeah, I think to go go in and abate, I guess, the question is, do we only do the exterior stabilization and just leave the interior alone? Or do we try and do some level of ventilation to get some air moving and improve the indoor air quality? The challenge is, as soon as we look at doing any kind of air movement, now we need to get into abating the mold. And I would expect that, those three buildings could easily eat up that 1.7 million.
But then also, are you also, does it make sense, like, we have to debate the mold in the entire building, not just those three portions of the building, if we're gonna put air handling systems in, right?
Just seal the buildings off.
Well, we can go in and seal off the doors from building 23 into the connecting link, and the same thing from building 27 into the connecting link. So you basically isolate building 23 and isolate building 27, and you can do the same thing with building 1. You can seal the doors that go from building 1 into the connecting link on the north side of building 1 that was added after building 1 was constructed. That can be sealed, so you're basically isolating those three buildings. So then you only do the mold remediation in those three buildings, you only do the air handling in those three buildings, and everything else is now separate.
Brian?
Yeah, Your Honor, based on what I'm hearing and everything, no, you're right, it's just unknown. We clearly do know 1.7 is not going to address all these matters that we're talking about. So, as I'm kind of reading through or just hearing from the conversation, I think, we talked about number one, I'm just going to, what the council thinks. But I guess the appetite for replacing the windows in the second, third, and floor for the towers, we could look to do something like that as a priority in the base bid. Look at roof repairs for building 23 and 27. And then we got to talk about the mold mitigation. I think we're going to have to talk for a consultant, but I think maybe the council wants to tackle mold first in the whole tower. And then like we just mentioned about isolating the buildings 23, 27, we're not going to be able to probably get perhaps the whole entire campus. And then in addition to the mold mitigation, we can look at air handling units once again throughout the whole entire tower, and then do a piecemeal for building 23 and 27. Not to mention 23 and 27 has no power, so we'd have to extend power as well to those. And then miscellaneous repairs. But just based on what I said, I would have to think that's a pretty close expenditures what we have for those projects. Like I mentioned, we could put together probable cost for some of these, and we could bring back to the council more a la carte type of review, just to mention the perimeter fence as well. And wherever we get at too, figure out what the base documents look like for the bidding documents. We can always bid a series of alternates too, based on some of these other areas that we want to explore. But right now, like I said, we don't have enough funds, so just based on what I talked about, is that what the council wants to explore for next steps?
Sure. Bill had a comment, and then Justin.
Yeah, want to pipe in just a little bit. And Bruce, I'm just going to think out loud a little bit here as I read the legislative language. When we have mold in the buildings, does that impact structural integrity of the building? Or is it's a nuisance, but does it structural? Okay, Brian's saying yes, so you can see where my mind is going. Will mold abatement qualify under the funds? So I want to
Hazardous material abatement,
It could fall under that too, I was thinking.
Yes.
Well, I know that related more to the demo side of things, but, okay.
But, yeah, we definitely obviously need to make sure that whatever it is we're going to do qualifies under
Yeah.
the state. Justin?
Just maybe a comment to add to what Brian's saying, I guess, in my mind, we've got a limited amount of resources, and obviously this creates unique challenges. For me personally, I'd like to know what the punch list is there, and what does that punch list consist of, dollars and cents? Is it $10 million to do all of these things, or what is the number? Because we got 1.7. Because then I think that for me anyway, that would help dictate how do we utilize the limited resources we have. You know, if we're only gonna be able to get 2 items out of that punch list completed, or 3, in the overall scope of the entire things that need to happen, how far does it make sense to continue on putting the resources in? Or what's our next plan to get more resources to continue that entire punch list? Because it's a pretty deep scope of all the buildings and what needs to happen. And, you know, at some point, if we utilize all those funds and we have no more funds, then we have to have a discussion of what does that look like if this facility does not sell. So I personally like to see a worst case cost with an a la carte to it, because I feel like if we do some of these things, if the problem's still going to continue creating a problem, then we're going to be back to the same point with low air quality and people breaking in and, you know, those line items. So I agree with what's said. I just think it'd be nice to know worst case scenario what the overall cost is before we start spending time on boarding up the lower windows. That might not be very beneficial if the costs are just, you know, outside of what our budget's going to allow us to spend.
But, and then, do we have any idea of which are the most likely buildings to be redeveloped? You know, I mean, if we're going to put money into preserving Building A, I mean, obviously the tower is one, but I mean, you know, 23 and 27 are, you know, I mean, if they're in worse shape, you know, are we better to put our dollars into something that's, you know, somebody might redevelop?
Buildings 23 and 27 are the 2 oldest buildings after Building 1. Kind of the, you know, the pro with pursuing them as priorities 2 and 3 is that the connecting links that connect Building 23 to Building 24 and that connect Building 27 to Building 28 were constructed at a point where they're not historically significant, and SHPO does not have an issue with the connecting links being removed. So then buildings 23 and 27 could be standalone, separated from the rest of the campus buildings, which might make them more attractive to developers to develop.
Now that it raised one more question. This is Bill again. So the one thing our person from DEED also said is if we need to tweak this law, we can go to the legislative session in 2022. Like, if you as a council wanted to say the best use is getting rid of those connecting links because a standalone building is more marketable, we could tweak that legislation. She did tell me that if we needed to make changes, you can always go to legislation in 2022.
We'll get back to you over here, Brent. Go ahead, Scott, and then Tom.
I think that it's clear that we can't really move very far without some pricing on the pieces of this puzzle. And yet, it's also clear that we can certainly do a lot with what's being suggested. $1.5 million could certainly fix all the roofing problems, even if it just had to be scaled down to fixing what was a patching rather than full repair. Certainly, we could fix the roofs for that. And if I'm wrong, then let's see the numbers and prove me wrong, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. As far as how to approach it, though, I think that we need to take an attitude of just what is the goal. There doesn't seem to be any real clear definition of what the goal is here, and so I'd like to suggest one. The master plan has given us a pretty elaborate possible option for the future, that if through many developers or several years' time, those various things that were suggested in the master plan were all done, I think that would be a fantastic result for the city. And the report also included all of the information you needed to justify the demand for housing and the feasibility of the renovation of the place, as it is, not tearing down any more of it. So the goal ought to be to stop any further deterioration from what's there now, as it's a recognized asset of the city and ought to be maintained as such. And the first thing would be to fix the roofs. So as we're looking at what's the priorities, first thing would be to fix the roofs and take care of the water problems. The second thing that I would like to suggest is the fact that next year is the 150-year sesquicentennial year for the Fergus Falls, city of Fergus Falls. The Regional Treatment Center is seriously one of the biggest reasons this town still exists like it does. It ought to be a highlight of any information that's out there about, what makes Fergus Falls special for 150 years. And that ought to include tours of that building. And so whatever we would need to do to make the central tower building 1 portion accessible for people next summer for tours, I think that ought to be our second goal. So if we were to do, as Bruce suggested, seal off those connecting links on building 1, get air through there, get the mold taken care of, get the place cleaned out so that it's safe, it's got proper, fire code access for the stairways, it's got some lighting in it, and it can be moved through at any time by anyone safely, I think that would be a terrific second goal. So those would be the 2 things I would put at the top of the list, fixing the roof and the water problems, making the center portion accessible for tours, and then let's see what kind of money we've got left. And if we can put some money into 23 and 27 or go any further, fantastic.
Thanks, Scott. Tom?
Yeah, my position on the RTC has been pretty clear. If somebody were to show up with a duffel bag full of cash today, it would still be years before there was any project that actually happened. And I'm pretty skeptical as to whether or not there will be anything that happens. But I would strongly recommend that we focus our money on the buildings that have a chance of being redeveloped, a lot like what Brent said. The tower, I think stands the best chance. I'd use as much of the money there as we can, because I think that putting any money anywhere else other than, to try to keep people out of it is going to be a waste.
Thanks, Tom. Brent?
Yeah, and I agree with that. The only thing that I don't agree with what they were just talking about is that we have to leave this up for a while because we don't have enough money to take it down. The connecting links, I think, should stay, because the 2 end buildings have been the only ones that any developer said were large enough to do anything. And their architect told them, save the connecting links. Those elevator shafts in those connecting links are very expensive to replace and put inside the existing buildings. And that would be the one thing that was gonna make it marketable if you do it. So it's like, until we know what we're going to do with them, like I said, like Scott said, I don't want to replace the roof, but go up there and find out where it's leaking, fix it, seal the windows up, just so in case we get lucky, but then focus on the building 1, put any money that we have to into that, and seal it off from the remainder, try to see if we can get the mold issue taken care of, and then just, let's just hope and pray that something happens with the rest. But I think their own architects told them, don't take those down, because that's your elevator shafts, and that's a major expense for any developer.
Thanks, Brent.
And I agree with that, but fortunately, the elevators are right next to Building 23 and Building 27. So it would be, you could still remove the majority of the connecting link, and just close off the end wall just past the elevator to allow the elevator to still access Building 23 and 27, but you can still eliminate the majority of the connecting links.
So the scope of the proposal that is before us would allow us to have the information that we're asking for, correct? To go out to have, I believe the proposal is that Stantec would go out and get bids on the work that's outlined in this.
Correct.
Is that correct?
I suppose the question to that is, where does that get funded from?
Yeah, so is it
Would be
50?
my next question. Does
50?
that qualify against the grant funds?
Historically, engineering has.
Okay, it historically has. That's good, because we only have like $32,000 left in our holding cost fund, so we are running out of money over with our Fund 207 you've heard us talk about over the years. that's where we're paying the electric bill and whatnot out of right now, so.
Ben?
Yeah, Scott?
I think that the proposal that we were looking at from 2015 isn't current enough to just say, well, let's have them go and get prices for all of this. But I think that we can all probably agree that having them getting prices on ventilation systems for 6 buildings that we just know are going to be beyond the cost, for example, we shouldn't necessarily expect to get those prices now. Why don't we move toward having a smaller scope of the first question of, what's it going to cost to fix the roofs? What's it going to cost to fix the ventilation and mold in 1, 23, and 27? Get those numbers and then see if we've got room to go any further. If we ask them to give us everything and they spend a lot of money on stuff that we're not going to get, then we've spent money on something we don't need. So I understand that it's try and make this money go as far as possible. Why don't we just focus on those 3 and get the information for the roofs and the ventilation and mold for those 3 and take it from there?
Yeah, can I ask that to clarify?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Scott. I'm not sure how much.
I mean, this report even includes looking into Building 3 and Building 25, where those buildings were gone years ago. So I mean, this is not a very current thing to work from as a document.
So, Your Honor, if I may, so if I
Yeah,
understand what you're saying, Scott, it would be looking for the 3 priorities would be the roof, and that would be for 23, 27, and 1, or the roof for the entire campus?
Yeah, I guess that, I didn't make that very clear.
And then the air remediation would just be for those 3 as well?
Well, I think that would be a fair place to start. Those 3 buildings and those priorities, and then the next step would be any other roofs and water problems on whatever other buildings, and then not necessarily any further work on the other buildings, whether it would be ventilation or any other things that were, the cleaning and the air conditioners and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we need some numbers so we know what and where we can go, and what we can do. I mean, we can sit here all day saying we'd like to do this, this, and this. Until we have numbers, we don't know what we can do.
So the numbers we want are what's outlined on buildings 1, 23, and 27, and
That is
then,
correct.
and then the roof. Is that what I hear you saying, Scott?
That's
Just so we
what I
have that
was-
number. I don't think to give an estimate on the,
And I think you're going to be, I think coming back to Scott's question, you're going to be way over 1.8 million if you include the roof. You'll spend 1.8 million just on the roof, I think.
Well, with numbers,
Yeah.
we're going to know that.
Yeah. But
hey, Bruce?
I think you could replicate it.
Yeah, that's-
The buildings are kind of basically, 60,000 square feet plus or minus. Ventilation in building 27 is not going to be indifferent than building 28 and like on. I know it's hard work to get quotes out of contractors. And so if you're going to ask them to do a lot of work and you're only really going to spend 1.8 million, if I'm a contractor, I'm going to bid it either high or I'm not going to bother. So I think coming back to Scott's kind of thing, we've got 1.8 million, let's concentrate where we want to spend it, rather than putting a contractor to a lot of work that they're not going to do, or they don't want to do. I don't know, if you find the same, Brian?
Yes, you're correct. I just wanted, we haven't even initiated a project yet. I think the
Yeah.
purpose of this is just does the council have an appetite for spending the $1.7 million? It sounds to be so I can go back to the drawing board with Bruce here, based on what we've heard, and start putting some actual cost estimates prior to actually coming back with a proposal for the bid documents, because we have to follow competitive bidding guidelines too as well, based on the scope of work. So that'd be the next step, is start putting some estimates on what we're just, all these conversations, and then we can further hone in the scope based on those prioritization of those costs.
sure. I probably misunderstood that. I thought this was an updated version of, but it looks like this is, the dates on it, to me, I didn't follow along. So, yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. You have a pretty good idea of where the council's at as far as what they improvements they want to see or willing to look at?
Perimeter fence I got, as well as some additional work, and not sure if we'll have approval to see if it's an eligible expense and everything, but I think for purposes of providing the framework for the contract documents, I think we can come back here in the next month or so here with some more refined estimates, and then we can hone in on scope. And then set up a public improvement project, and then go through the necessary process for bidding it out.
Is that reasonable to everyone? Anyone from the public have any comments they'd like to make? Yeah, Lori, please.
Yeah. Lori Mullen, 2840 Lakewood Drive. I think it was 2 years ago, I had talked with SHPO, and they had some grants. And I don't recall what that particular grant was called, but I had talked to them about the mold remediation, and they said that it was something that they would look at potentially funding. And I asked them if there was a dollar amount, and they said there wasn't, because, you know, they had never done anything like this before, building this size, but they were very much interested in getting numbers. We also had a preservation group, and Scott, maybe I talked with you about this before. It was, I think, a group out in Detroit, or Duluth, that they'll go into historic places and help with cleanup. The one thing that they do want is that the mold to be looked at, and so certainly 23, 27, and the main building, if we had some mold remediation in those buildings, they would be glad to go in and do the cleanup. They would also help with boarding up windows and cleaning up brush and those types of things. So it's just some extra resources we might tap into.
Sure. Thank you, Lori. Anyone else? All right. So, Brian, do you feel like you have the information you need?
Feel I have enough to come back with more refinement, yes.
Sure. And you'll work with Bruce. Bruce, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Good night.
All right. Cool. We will take a break and come back at 5:30.